Hi, everybody. Uh, as I said via email that I was going to provide you with a brief exam review for exam 2. So we have chapters 6. We have chapters 5, 7, 8, and 9. So making a living, chapter 5. Chapter 7, family, kinships, and marriage. Chapter 8 is gender, and chapter 9 is religion. And of course, the readings that accompany those chapters. But let me just say about this review. This review does not certainly cover, question by question or everything. What I do is I give you the general areas from which the questions are derived. So, from a study area, I may ask anywhere from 2 to 6 questions concerning that area of study. So, of course, there will also be, I'll give you several key concepts that I think will be central to the exam and that you should study a little closer. But just remember that most of what you're going to hear in this review is the study areas in which you'll have to familiarize yourself much better in order to do well on the exam. So we start then with the chapter on making a living. And again, as I had stated during the chapter review, that the central area that you need to study are the 5 adaptive strategies. The 5 adaptive strategies and the main characteristics of each. So if I ask you, if I give you an example of one of the main characteristics of one of the 5 adaptive strategies, then you may have to pick out from a list the correct adaptive strategy that characteristic would fit under, and vice versa. So you have to kind of really know these very well, so make sure you study them. Not much else I can say about Chapter 5 than in studying those 5 adaptive strategies and knowing the main characteristics. In the chapter on family and kinship, again, we're looking at some major areas. One area is to look at the definition of, also the relationships within patriarchy and matriarchy, looking at patriarchal societies and matriarchal societies. What are some of the major patterns of relationships we find in those 2 forms of family makeup? What is the definition of the family? What is the difference between a nuclear and an extended family form? Also very important for that chapter is understanding the incest taboo. And again, there's several concepts that come in pairs, cross comparisons, exogamy and endogamy. What is the difference between those 2? What's the definition, and what are some examples? Always look at examples of these concepts when you're doing your studies. So look at the major family patterns that are presented in that chapter. It's certainly those dealing with patrilineal and matrilineal. I want you to focus on closely on the patrilineal, patrilocal complex, and especially how that works out for the status of women in that family pattern. I also want you to be able to distinguish between bride wealth and dowry. Also, look at the status of women in each of the adaptive strategies, and which societies are, and under which adaptive strategies and conditions are most favorable for a higher status of women. Which is the lowest in terms of producing a low status for women. Then in the chapter on gender, certainly be able to define gender and what is the difference between gender and sex. You know, our sex is a biological reality, biological concept, whereas gender is a cultural concept, and cultures vary by their definitions of the characteristics that are attached, the norms, the gender norms that are attached to being a male or female in this culture. And again, that varies by historical time and across culture. So gender is a cultural construction. We're culturally constructed by gender in terms of, for example, in the United States, we have certain male characteristics, certain female characteristics, and of course that will vary in other cultures. Also, some concepts which looks at the complexity of gender in terms of gender organization, social organization, gender stratification, for example. You need to look at that. What is gender stereotypes? Also primary, secondary sexual characteristics, distinguish between those two. And the importance of gender roles in society. So, and another important area to study is the public-domestic dichotomy. And we look at the public-domestic dichotomy in terms of the 5 adaptive strategies. So we want to look at which adaptive strategies has the least public domestic dichotomy, and under which kinds of adaptive strategies have a very strong public domestic dichotomy. And we know from studies that those societies that have the least public domestic dichotomy, that have the least difference between what goes on in the home sphere and what goes on in the public arena, women's statuses tend to be higher in that type of adaptive strategy or situation. Also in the chapter, they look closely at gender in modern America. So you want to look at the historical developments of in terms of gender relations in the United States over a time. And by the time you finish with that 3rd chapter, then we're already at question 39 on a 50 question test. So in terms of the last chapter on religion, which will make up those last 20 questions, first I wanted to look at the definition of religion, how it's defined. Then you really need to focus as a general study area. You really need to focus on the various forms historically of religion. So polytheism, animism, monotheism, for example. Look at those, look at examples of those, and look at the characteristics of each. Also, the study of the phenomena of mana, M-A-N-A. Make sure that you touch base with that area. Also, to distinguish certain aspects of magic. So look at the definition of magic and examples. And we have a great example, modern example, in the reader when we look at that magic and ritual among baseball players. Also, Olympianism. Make sure you touch base. Also touch base with the various examples that give you of rites of passage. Rites of passage. They also talk about, in terms of rites of passage, an area, a concept of liminality. So what is liminality? And kind of familiarize yourself with some of the examples they give in the chapter. And so, again, certainly the test is more involved than what I just said in terms of the specific questions, but these are the areas from which the exam at the end of the week will come from. That I guarantee you. So if you'll take these areas after you've read the chapters and then go back and try to study as much as possible these areas and familiarize yourself with these concepts, be able to distinguish between them. Think of the examples they give, and if you can do that, then I think you'll do very well on the exam. And I'll be back shortly. We don't have much longer for that final exam. So you'll notice that for the final exam,